these guys. Oh, another big hand block. Tipped again.
Jordan Kerr is going to capitalize quickly. If Luke can pull it down, he's going to jump up and pull it down over Santi for the score.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 4 preview coming right at you. I'm Adam Ruffner. That's Daniel Cohen. We'll get right into it because we've got another 12-game slate ahead on the schedule. We're rounding towards the end of the first month of play in the 2023 season. Every one of the 24 teams has already played a game so far, so we're starting to get a sense of what the true landscape is while we're still working into the beginning part of this schedule. We wanted to kind of take a check-in today because there isn't necessarily a huge prime time major matchup, yet there are so many important divisional matchups going into week 4 that we thought it would be a good idea to just kind of go for a potpourri and kind of sample everything that there is to offer on this incredible slate. You can tune in and watch the AUDL.tv to watch all 12 of the live games. And we're just going to dig right into it. We wanted to start with a trio of undefeated teams who sit near the top of their respective divisional standings. The Boston Glory, Pittsburgh Thunderbirds, and Atlanta Hustle will all be going on the road for the first time in 2023, despite none of them taking a loss so far in their schedules. Wanted to start off with the Pittsburgh Thunderbirds going to face the Minnesota Wind Chill in a battle in the Central Division. Pittsburgh is a team that we expected to be pretty feisty coming into the season. Max Shepard had a terrific all-star game yet again last fall. They returned some of their veterans in the backfield, and Jonathan Mast, Clint McSherry have been playing really well. The defense is a little bit revitalized, but not only has their elevated play put them a little bit more in a playoff position in the Central Division, there's just kind of chaos in the rest of this Central landscape, as we kind of hinted at going into this in the preseason. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the T-Birds going to face the Chill and what should otherwise be a pretty robust divisional rivalry? But these two teams haven't really squared off that many times in the past 3 seasons. Minnesota's held a slight edge. It feels like the Thunderbirds could potentially shock, excuse my pun, the Wind Chill as they get set to host their home opener.
Yeah, it's interesting because Pittsburgh, I mean, it's always hard to put so much weight on the Detroit games, right? But I do think if you look at Pittsburgh's more recent games against Detroit, they weren't real. They were like the one Central Division team that was not just like automatically blowing them out every time. But that's exactly what happened this past weekend. Obviously, they got that big week 1 win over Madison. But again, like it's still hard to know what to make of Pittsburgh this early in the season, just based on those 2 games. I do think they have something special in Max Shepard. Jonathan Mast coming back to the lineup has been absolutely huge. Like their throwing core, their backfield looks really good. And I know it's only been 2 games, but I think that's gonna what will build their offensive identity this season. So I'm excited to see that in like what should be a pretty competitive road environment in Minnesota. Minnesota always brings out pretty good home crowd. The home opener is a big deal for them. And then on Minnesota's end, I'm just excited to see them play their first outdoor game. Like whenever a team goes to Indy, there's always an asterisk by those games. Turnovers are always down. We don't know exactly if it's like, you know, the top version of the team that we're seeing or if things are just inflated by the indoor environment. But they battled in Indy. I know they're excited to be back at home. So it's really a huge game for both these teams.
Well, and it's sort of a perfect juxtaposition, too, because I don't know that there's more of a contrary in styles than Grand Park and Indy versus the wind tunnel that is Seafoam Stadium. I mean, we get some of the craziest wind weather games at Minnesota's home venue. So that should be certainly a part of this matchup. I just wanted to touch on 2 things. I think I'm really excited to see the Pittsburgh throwing unit that is clearly at an elevated level this year. As you referenced, Mast and McSherry are playing super well. Shepard has drastically reduced his turnover rate in the first 2 games of the season. We'll see if he can continue that play when he's able to put up the kinds of scoring production numbers and not contribute to sometimes the inflated turnover count that Pittsburgh can generate at times. he's just so dangerous, right? Like we've seen it 1,000 times. He was the MVP runner-up in 2019. He was fantastic in the All-Star game again last fall, as we started off the show saying, like, when he's playing at this level and not taking things away from what their offense is trying to do and not costing possessions, he truly looks like one of the 10 best players in this league. And that's kind of where he's playing at right now. And so I want to see what this Pittsburgh team does against a Minnesota defense that has, I think, been a little bit underlauded for its ability to be disruptive, generate takeaways. We saw it in the week 1 win against Indy, or excuse me, week 2 win against Indy, where they generated a whole bunch of turns in the second half through big defensive plays. I think that they might bring that energy against the Thunderbirds team that has played against maybe the 2 bottom 8 defenses so far this year. Madison does not quite look like they are up to their defensive pedigree right now. They had a tough time with that Thunderbirds throwing attack in week 1. Thunderbirds played Detroit last weekend, obviously the worst defense in the league. So I want to see this Thunderbirds team go up against a much more stout Minnesota defense. And then kind of flipping that around, I think the biggest concern for the Thunderbirds going into this matchup might be limiting the Minnesota attack. You know, they face a Madison team who looked pretty good in their first game of the season, but introducing a lot of new pieces. They're always kind of in flux. They're always dealing with injuries. We like Madison at times, but to call them a top unit or elite, I think would be mistaken. And then again, Detroit. So Pittsburgh now going and facing off against a wind chill offense that features throwers like Josh Klain, Abe Coffin, Colin Berry looked so good in his offensive role. Marco Dregny is getting involved. They have Quinn Snyder closing out. Michael Jordan will be available in this game, and he is so good and essential to what this wind chill offense likes to do. I'm a little worried about Pittsburgh defensively matching up with all of that. I think Minnesota's going to be very motivated at home. They play very well at home these days. And so those are kind of where my thoughts go to as far as where the friction points are, I think, in this matchup. But
right. I'm curious, like if this game gets super windy, like it's going to be a test on both these teams' throwers, because Minnesota did lose obviously Andrew Roy, Cole Jurek, Tony Paletto, like some pretty core throwing talents to their O-line. And again, we've only seen them indoors so far. So like, I don't know if just like pure throwing talent and ability to throw in windy conditions is going to be their strength. Whereas with Pittsburgh, I'm sort of thinking that it might be theirs. Like, I think Pittsburgh's offense might be better suited to play in super windy conditions, but it all remains to be seen. Like, I just don't think Minnesota's been truly tested yet as far as conditions go.
So moving along to one of the undefeateds on the road, let's go to Boston, traveling up to Montreal. They're taking their 2-0 undefeated record at Hormel Stadium on the road against an 0-1 Royale team who will be making a huge list of 2023 debuts headlined by their 2022 All-Star Jacob Brissett. A bunch of U24 members will be joining Montreal for their first game. Last year, at almost the exact same time, this was sort of the pitfall game for Boston, where I believe they committed almost 30 turnovers in their loss at Montreal. Speaking of a wind-plagued game, Montreal's defense took major advantage of that. I expect that to kind of be the case yet again. Montreal will have CTJ available in this game. Him and Kevin Quinlan and Malik Algier-Samar looked great in their 2023 debuts last weekend at Toronto. What do you expect for this matchup? This is kind of an interesting undercard because either way the result goes, it really, I think, magnifies how much we don't know about this East Division, because either you have 3-0 Boston, who I wouldn't have predicted them to start 3-0, knowing that they just had a road game, you know, like they don't play well on the road. That's going to be a big question for them in this matchup. Versus a Montreal team who might take one away from a pretty good Boston team and start 1-1 and kind of put themselves right in the thick of an East Division that would then have one loss for every team but New York if the Royale succeed in winning against Boston. So there's just there's kind of a lot of interesting ways that this game can go no matter what the result is.
Yeah, I mean, Boston, like, I don't think we've ever seen them bring a good like top 20 roster on the road, right? Like that has been why they've been bad on the road previously.
They did in the beginning of 2021 when they played DC and Carolina in back-to-back days, and they got blown out by DC on Friday night. But then on Saturday night, they played a much closer game with the Flyers, ended up falling in that one. But
yeah, but even still, like I don't think they had Cable or like Tanner Johnson for those games. Like I don't know.
I
think
traditionally travel light. Yes, they were.
Yeah.
So they still had Halkert and Sadok and like a good cast of playing players. But I hear you.
Yeah. So I'm most interested just to see like this is kind of the same roster at least as of right now on the website. This is the same roster that they've been playing with through the first 2 games of the season. So that's kind of been the kind of why we've been so down on Boston in the past, at least me personally. It's just because like they have the potential, they have the ceiling of like a lot of good players playing well together. We just haven't seen the week to week roster consistency. But if they can put that together this year, and I think obviously they're off to a great start, and we'll see how they do on the road. I'm starting to be a believer in Boston. I still need to see it a little bit more consistently. But the fact they're going up to Canada, that traditionally that's a road trip where a lot of guys will not travel to, just distance, the border, whatever it is. I think Boston is going to have a real shot at winning this game, and I think Montreal is going to put up a really good fight too. Because, like you said, the amount of debuts that they have this week, and I actually thought they played pretty well last week too. Their offensive efficiency was actually up around 59-60%. And that was like 10 percentage points higher than what they did last year. Obviously, the Toronto defense I don't think is super great this year, but they have some new guys that are playing well. They moved CTJ over to offense last week, which I like that switch. I think Montreal has just as high a ceiling as anyone else in the East right now. I just think we have to see the current iteration of the roster to see what they're able to put together. But it definitely feels like Montreal will be better off this year than they were last year if they can field this specific roster enough times throughout the season.
This is very much like a contender-pretender matchup, right? Where one team is going to kind of surge in one direction and have a lot more confidence, and I think the other team might be left holding the bag with a lot of questions, right? Because Boston lost, that again invokes this, what are we doing when we travel? Why can we not win these games when we go on the road? And for Montreal, it's sort of what has happened since we won that 2021 Canada Cup final, and how do we kind of get back to that elevated status and trending upward again? Because like you say, there are still times where you watch this Real team and you go, that's a bunch of really nice pieces, right? Like that's something we can work with. It's just it only congeals for a quarter or two at a time right now. So
they feel a little similar to Oakland in some ways. Montreal does, like young guys like look like they're clicking fantastically at times, some really talented throwers too, but they still just kind of like make some weird mistakes at times. So yeah, I think consistency is just going to be key for their team this year.
Boston too. They went down 7 at home to Philly before
definitely
they
Boston
orchestrated that crazy comeback. So
yeah,
that'll be interesting. And then moving right along to the last of the undefeateds on the road for the first time, Atlanta will be facing off for round 2 against Carolina, traveling to face the Flyers. That matchup will be on Sunday, the lone game on Sunday in week 4. Atlanta took the first matchup 2 weeks ago, facing the Flyers in Atlanta. I believe the final score was 21-17. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Atlanta closed that game in a 6-2 run. I remember it was the Brett Holzmeier game. He just kind of took over alongside Liam Haberfield. They were so good for them. The hustle continued to do it on both sides of the disc. They're the top-rated, most efficient offense, and they've got, I think, one of the best counterattacking defenses. The Flyers, meanwhile, finally got off the schneid, got their first win of 2023 this past weekend at home, molly-whopping Austin 26-17, something like that.
26-19, I think.
Yeah, I think it was something like that. I need to write this stuff down. It was a large margin score. Whenever it's that kind of margin, it's like that was really impressive. As the 2023 debut of Liam Searles-Bowes, he played so well for the Flyers. They finally kind of got that stability on offense that we've been looking for through their first 2 losses of the season. And so now they've got that little bit of confidence, that little bit of fire that has been so good for Carolina's motivation the past several seasons. And they square off against this undefeated Atlanta team, just clicking on all cylinders. And I think this game is both really important, but because it's the second of 4 times these 2 teams will meet this season, it's going to be another diagnostic. You know, we talked about it after that first game. Other than Fairfax just going monster mode against the hustle defense, Carolina was very much in flux. And it felt a little like they might have been throwing up some smoke screens with their lineups at times. They weren't super serious. They weren't super consistent. It felt very much in flow of the rhythm as they kind of rode hot hands. They'd rise and then they'd have some points where they would fall, illustrated by the hustle taking hold of that game down the stretch with a series of scores. I expect this game might be a little bit more of a return to form for Carolina. I think this might be the most we see the recognizable Flyers that have been a championship level contender now for several seasons. I think, to your point, as we were talking in the pregame, this is probably the strongest lineup iteration we will see so far from the Flyers. They're going to be having, again, Liam Searles-Bowes in the lineup. Joe White, who missed the last start, he'll be available again. There's a host of just ready and willing playmakers. Jacob Fairfax is, quite frankly, again, just playing at like an MVP level. I mean, he's doing it all. He's doing his stuff where if the offense turns it over, he's like winning the disc back within 3 throws. It's like some mega block. He continues to be, I think, you know, when we talk about buzzer beater athletes, I think Jeff Babbitt rightfully goes to the top of many people's lists. I really think Fairfax is starting to get to 1A, 1B. I know we don't have end of quarter stats for scoring or any kind of split stats, but in terms of just goals, anecdotally at the end of quarters, Fairfax has to be like top 3.
You trust him.
You put it up to him and he comes down with it. It doesn't really matter the scenario. You can kind of laser it. You can throw a jump ball. There's the MAC against DC. You know, it doesn't matter. He's going to come away with it. He did it again this last week against Austin. He has that ability. He's a disc hawkman. And I think he's going to do it again in this matchup. He just seems motivated this season. He's got that scowl going. It's all business all the time with him.
Do you think in this game that Carolina is going to tighten up their lines more than we've seen? Because this is the first game of the season that both Saul Yannick and Matt Gujohannes are active playing together. So like they kind of have enough throwers where it seems like they can just kind of go back to basics on offense. Maybe Elijah Long moves back to the defense. I don't know. It's just seemed to this point they haven't even labeled their O-lines and D-lines. So I'm curious to see what approach they take with their best lineup to date.
Yeah. And likewise, I'm interested to see what the hustle will do. They're going to be experiencing a possibility of 3 of their offensive starters being absent in Carl Eckwurzel, Max Thorne, and Liam Haberfield. All 3 have made big contributions when they've been available in the lineup. I'm both worried about that in a matchup of this caliber where I think both teams need as much firepower as they can have available. But also, given how well everyone seems primed to step up into roles, I'm not too concerned. And especially when Atlanta still has their 3 main throwers available and Austin Taylor, Christian Olsen, and Bobby Lay, who have been playing so well as a trio in distributing the disc and getting the action moving. I'm not as concerned because they still, you know, this is a lineup that still features Matt Smith, who doesn't have a turnover this year, Brent Hulsmeyer, who looks like a MVP candidate, and Dean Ramsey coming off of a career game where he was just mossing everyone within a vicinity. They have
Misha Freistetter too. You want to add?
Misha Freistetter is pretty good at offense. What is it?
I would also circle Hayden Austin-Knapp as a potential player that they might play some O points for this week. He played mostly D-line last week, but I think that was sort of personnel based. Historically, he hasn't played a ton for Atlanta, like total games wise, but he typically has been playing more offense for them. So, I mean, he's just a guy you can put in anywhere and he will probably have an impact. So, right. I think you look at their absences and it's like, yeah, it's not ideal, but whenever you can have Dean Ramsey, Brett Hulsmeyer, and Misha Freistetter on the field together, I don't see the issue.
that's a Monstar lineup. That's a basketball lineup. I mean, we've talked before. Atlanta, I think it's New York and Atlanta might have the two best basketball lineups from AUDL teams, and there's no secret as to why the Hustle might be really, really good on the court. I think you pointing out Hayden Austin-Nab is super, super apt. I've been hearing from Hustle Camp and players that he's just been chomping at the bit at practice, like one of the best looking players that they have available when he's been practicing. He's been on defense a bunch this year and continues to make like a big block per start. If they insert him on offense, I could absolutely see him going off. He has one of the most natural looking flick hooks I've ever seen. He doesn't show it off a whole bunch of pro. Nice. Like a couple years ago at colleges, he just took over at nationals with that thing. So if he gets into a groove, if he maybe gets into that kind of shooter role that Liam Haberfield has been occupying, I could absolutely see him weaponizing that forehand to big effect for the Hustle. But we should continue to move on. I wanted to get to another trio of road trips, these all coming in the West Division, and these being kind of the playoff hopefuls in Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Diego, all getting geared up for 2-game doubleheader road trip weekends. Los Angeles will be inarguably one of the toughest 2-team gauntlets in the AUDL because they're going to be taking on the Salt Lake Shred on Friday night and then going and facing the Colorado Summit on Saturday. Both the Shred and the Summit are two of the most athletic teams. They love to run opponents, and then you've got to deal with that altitude. It's just going to be a huge early season test for the Aviators. They're really going to have to get their crew running. Oakland will be up in the Pacific Northwest facing off against Portland and Seattle. It will be their first time away from their home venue where they've opened up the season with back-to-back overtime finishes, splitting both of those games. A lot of things I like about the Spiders, but also they're one of the youngest teams, and as we've continued to say, there's just a lot of variance when you have that much youth in your lineup. San Diego also will be on a Texas two-step. On Friday, they will be facing off against the Havoc in Houston, and then on Saturday, they will be in the AUDL Game of the Week, taking on the Austin Soul, a rematch, a 2021 interdivisional game between these two teams where the Growlers orchestrate a huge comeback on the road, winning at Austin. We'll see if the Growlers can get it done. They will be without Travis Dunn this weekend, who was just phenomenal in their win last weekend. But they do return Paul Lally. There's some hope for the Growlers. It's just a really interesting slate of games for all the teams involved in these road trips, I think. We should maybe start with LA because we kind of think of them as being the 3rd seed right now in the West. They go on and take ostensibly the top 2 in Salt Lake and Colorado on Friday and Saturday nights. So, Aviators open with a loss to the Summit in week 2. This last week, they get a win at home by 7 goals against the Nitro. What do you expect for the Aviators going into this big back-to-back? What would be your mindset approach? Is this we're going in and winning both games, we're splitting these, doesn't matter, we're winning the Colorado game, we need the Colorado game, we want the confidence from the Colorado game. What happens if we go 0-2? There's, again, it's kind of like the Boston-Montreal matchup. I don't know how to take any of the results here for the Aviators road trip.
Right. I don't know. I almost compare it to Austin going on the road to Atlanta and Carolina, where maybe Austin probably felt they had a better chance of winning than I'm guessing LA thinks that they have a chance of winning against Salt Lake and Colorado. But still, I think if they do lose both games, which is what I would predict is going to happen, I just think Salt Lake is playing so well offensively, and Colorado is still Colorado, and it's just like there's not much LA can do, especially in that road environment. At altitude, 2 big home crowds that really rally behind their teams every single game. I think if LA can keep the losses to within 5 goals, maybe within 3 goals, I would view that as a pretty positive weekend for them. They're still this is kind of the first game because Michael Kioy is back this game. This is the first time we're going to see their top O-line. So they haven't even all played together at the same time yet. They've kind of had some missing pieces both games so far. So this is still so early in the season. It's going to be hard to put much weight into what LA looks like at this point. But I think all they can hope for is just to put up a good fight in both these games. I'm sorry I don't have more confidence in them. But you can also never count them out because of the uncertainty with their lineups, with the rotations. Who knows? Maybe they come in and this O-line just clicks from the start and they put up a bunch of points. Because it did look very good against Portland. I will say that. It looked like a mess against Colorado, but I do think the addition of Brandon Van Dusen in particular really opens a lot up. And Pavel's completing, 70 throws a game right now. So as long as you have those two guys, if they're clicking at altitude, I think it could go LA's way this weekend.
I think going on the road and just seeing how they played in the final 3 quarters against Portland, I agree with you in some ways, because I do think the Aviators are figuring out to keep it simple, stupid, right? They're simplifying things. You could see Pavel after the first few drives where they were kind of getting back into that weird headspace that they had against Colorado, where they were just taking too many shots with the disc downfield.
Right.
You can see Pavel just doing every other drives. He's like, no, we're just getting this disc into the end zone. It's going to be the most boring drive you've ever seen, but we're getting this hold. I think that they're going to do more and more of that, and obviously intersperse it with some of the fast break play that they love to orchestrate off of Van Dusen and some of those other playmakers in that Aviators offense. But I typically agree. I just think that this is a matter of firepower when you go on the road and face these two teams in the Shred and the Summit. And this Aviators team just maybe doesn't have it yet. I think that they're still getting there. I think, again, there's nice pieces all over the place, but that's not going to be quite enough to overcome this Shred team that's just going to blow you up from the beginning of the first quarter. They love to take those 8-3 leads at home at Zion Bank Stadium more than I think any other team in the league. It's Jorgensen's upon Jorgensen's just making plays on your head. And then for the Summit, they look like one of the best defenses this year, as we kind of thought they might. They're just stout. They're tall. They're big. They run fast. Matthew Agee's flying around and just detonating discs no matter where they are in the air. They've got more playmakers than ever before. I mean, Kai Marshall looks great. Connor Olson leading their counterattack. He finally looked fully up to this last week. That's just a scary addition. That's not fair to add to your counterattack. He was one of the best offensive players at 2019 championship weekend for the runner-up Dallas team then. He's sort of had a myriad of injuries since. I don't think people recognize what he's actually capable of at times, and I think he's finally getting that confidence back, and him getting to lead that counterattack with Kai Marshall and company. It's just scary when they have so many opportunities with the blocks that they get already to have that kind of a person leading the counter. I really like where Colorado's at. I really like where Salt Lake's at. I just kind of see this almost as a feeler for both of those teams, as a pseudo test for when they finally start to meet up. I think that's coming up in 2 to 3 weeks, right? When the first Salt Lake Colorado matchup. Yeah, I think in about a month. I think now I would only say New York is the team that has a chance of doing well on this Salt Lake Colorado road trip. It is looking like one of the hardest ones in the entire league. So again, nothing against LA. Obviously, worst case scenario would be a blowout loss to either of these teams, but I don't think it's going to come to that. I think LA is going to do enough to keep these games close. Moving on to Oakland, they have been, I think, one of the more exciting teams as far as they have definitely shown some of the parts and the sort of ceilings that we had anticipated. They've got this tremendous throwing attack. The rookies on this team. Dexter Clyburn just went off in his 2023 debut. He had some mistakes. He had over 600 yards of offense and was just clearly, visibly one of the best players in the fast break, which is something that Oakland loves to run. But they almost lost to Seattle, who's playing the second game in as many days in week 1. This last weekend, they had an opportunity to win it, and they had some of the weirdest red zone turnovers I've ever seen in my life. Spiders had the chance to put the game away essentially 2 different times inside the 5-yard line and just had throwaways. It's indicative, I think, of where this Oakland team is at, which is that they have all this potential, but it's not quite realized yet. They haven't had that many reps and practices together as this unit this year, right? Like it's been only a couple months. And so I just think you're seeing some of that. And while Portland and Seattle don't have a win between them yet in 7 games in 2023, I think that they're going to be pretty good tests for the Spiders and whether the Spiders are going to be a playoff team this year or not. Because I think if they drop either game, that's going to be at a disadvantage for Oakland. Because I don't think that they can afford that with the way that LA looks, with the way that they struggled to put Seattle away in week 1. There's just too many other, even San Diego. I think San Diego looks better than I had assumed. They've got some younger players who can really step up for them. Dunn looks great. Lally isn't as injured as it may have seemed like after his injury in week 2. So he might be able to return if they get both of them in the lineup. That's a supercharged offensive core for the Growlers, who again just have good coaching, have good system, have good history. That all plays into stuff. And so for Oakland, on this Pacific Northwest road trip, I'm looking for statement wins. I'm looking for, 2+ goals. Like we have wire to wire success. We're not doing these backfield turns. We're not turning the disc in the shadow of our own goal line, which has happened too many times for the Spiders, right? Like it's that perplexing thing where they love to get out quick into the open field. And when they get there, they're amazing. They've got these track athletes and stuff that can just gallop, and they've got throwers, they've got it all. But sometimes it takes a second for them to get that ignition going, and they just end up throwing it away in the backfield, on simple resets and stuff. And I think Seattle's motivated to take advantage of that. And I think this year the Nitro are too. Like their defense looks a step or 2 above where it did last year. Yeah.
No, I think Oakland, right, I'm still... Jury's still out on Oakland, my jury at least. I think we've seen a lot of good from them. Yeah, the problem is, right, like with the amount of throwers that they have on their offense, they're also taking like a very throw-heavy approach a lot of the time, almost DC-esque, where like most of their guys can hit continuation throws or run give and goes, and it looks really good at times. I just think like the overall polish isn't quite there yet. Like they just have to keep those turnover numbers down. And yeah, I think going to Seattle and going to Portland, those are not walk in the park type matchups. Like the Seattle team has been punchy this year. And I think the fact that they played Oakland so close and nearly beat them in the second day of a back-to-back on the road, I'm tempted to favor Seattle in this home game because I think Seattle plays super well at home. And it kind of feels like they're maybe due for a win too. And Portland playing at home, they're going to have most of their guys playing their top end roster. So I guess right now I'd be pleasantly surprised if Oakland can pull off a 2-0 weekend. But I agree with you, like they kind of have to do that if they want to stay in this West Division playoff race.
Khalif El-Salam will be active for the Cascades. He was not active last week when they traveled to face Colorado. Him and Zeppelin Roneg were just dynamite in that first matchup in Oakland alongside Garrett Martin. I expect all 3 of them to come out with big performances against the Spiders. I want to keep moving along. Let's move to the other SoCal team. The San Diego Growlers will be, again, going to Texas to face Houston and Austin on back-to-back nights this weekend. Let's talk about that first Friday night matchup. The 1-1 Growlers going against the 1-1 Havoc. Again, it's sort of indicative that there's multiple games like this weekend where one team's going to head this way after the result of this, and one team's going to head this way. Like, there's no other way to put it. For San Diego, right. I think you're going to have this confidence of, hey, man, we've had 2 of our best players out for both of our games so far. This would be the 3rd game that we're battling without one of them. And if we get this big road win against a Houston team that frankly looks interesting. I like how the Havoc are playing. I know it was Dallas. I know they're still turning the disc over a lot, but they put players in good positions to make plays. And when we talked with head coach Bex Forth before the season, that's exactly what she said she wanted to do. And so it's mission success or mission accomplished as far as setting out and doing what you said you were going to do. Anyways, I like the Growlers in this matchup. I like how they're playing. They're playing very within themselves. The fast break when they need to. Yeah. They'll take their downfield looks out into space when they get good at one-on-one receivers. But other than that, they play a lot of small ball. They're great in the red zone. They utilize their players in the positions well. Bryce Legzinski has been stepping up really nicely as a distributor on their offense. Their defense continues to just play make. Stephon Samu was really good in coverage on Leandro Marks last weekend.
He was winning that matchup. Yeah.
He came away with a couple of blocks that you frankly don't see against Marks. Marks, I think, one of his truest abilities is to go up early. And Samu out-jumped him earlier at least 2 different times to make plays on the disc. And he's just been, I think, really, really impressive for them. Even going back to last year, I think he led them in blocks last year, if I'm not mistaken.
He was up there. He looked great last year, too.
He was,
he's one of those guys that is, like, very capable of making layout blocks, like run-through Ds, critical spots in the red zone, too. I like him a lot. Quek Borner is also playing well. Those are like two very solid defenders. They still got Trevor Purdy back there too, all 6'6" of him.
They keep printing off these versions of Milardovich where it's like a lanky guy with gloves and a Growlers hat, and then they go out and they do pretty good things. Samu is like that. Gibson, the rookie last weekend, he was kind of doing that for them. He looked great as like a downfield playmaker, has some size, just naturally gets around the disc well. For Houston, they get their first win this past weekend on the road against Dallas, kind of led by their AUDL veterans in Ben Lewis and Matt Bennett, both of them coming up with big plays. Lewis, one of the best motors in the entire league.
Lewis runs wild.
He's so underrated, man. He's so underrated. Like, he's goes out there.
Underrated.
Did you see that play at the end of the first half where Dallas just puts up like a nothing Hail Mary? Houston has a sizable lead. Lewis, he's doing other coverage. He sees it just go up over his head.
At the start of that, before he took off, he was calling a travel on the Dallas player, and he was like, oh crap, like the disc went up, and then just took off deep.
It was the most Ben Lewis play because he's trying to do 2 things at once, but he realizes the actual priority, and he just puts his head down and books it. I don't know if the disc actually would have completed or not, but he goes racing out the back of the end zone, swats it. As he's tumbling, he comes up and he calls a timeout because he's still aware enough that if there's a second on the clock.
That sequence is like, it just captures all of the chaotic energy that I saw from Houston, where it works out really well sometimes. But like the fact he was mid-travel call, then just gets on his horse, lays out immediate time, like they're just like the movements of their bodies on that team just seem all over the place, but they looked good. And again, it was Dallas. I'm excited to see them in the game against the San Diego team that should be pretty well prepared. I mean, obviously we know no Travis Dunn this week, but in general, like you said, San Diego is a well-coached team, and I think they're going to put up a fight regardless of who their opponents are this season.
Absolutely. And again, like whoever wins this game comes away 2-1, and I think just has a lot of confidence.
That's big.
Going into the second game of the Growlers doubleheader road trip, they'll be facing the Soul again in the AUDL game of the week. The Soul coming off of a tough 0-2 road trip through Carolina and Atlanta. They presume to bounce back against San Diego. I think that they can take advantage of the Growlers. I'm just concerned because the Soul don't look like who they were exiting last year, particularly on offense. They're moonballing, man. Like they're out there shooting it, and that's fine. Kyle Henke uncorks a 60-yard hammer. Mark Evans is doing these teardrop scoobers and stuff. Like they have those throws, but that system offense that was just like running on people, that was running on Atlanta, that was running on Carolina, that had 7 throwers on the field that they could attack from virtually any angle. That's not there yet. They're sort of having like a little bit of here's the backfield drive where it's anchored by Fitzgerald and Radak, and maybe one of them shoots. Here's sort of the up tempo, we're running it through Henke Swiatek Evans drive, but it doesn't seem to coalesce. At least it didn't this last weekend, and I think that's owed to them getting 2 huge blowouts to start the season. I don't think they took maybe those matchups as seriously as they could have in terms of the development of reps and lineups and things. And it just came back to bite them this past weekend, where a much more prepared Atlanta team just kind of worked them from the opening whistle. And then Carolina did the same the next night. And I expect the Soul to maybe take the lessons learned from that and apply that in this matchup against the Growlers.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm not too worried about Austin this week. I think the greater takeaway would just be like, how they fare right now against the presumable other South Division playoff teams in Atlanta and Carolina. And yeah, you're right. Right now, I think Austin's offense is just not, like, the decision making just doesn't seem the same as it was overall last year. They still have put together those drives that are just like 5-throw, super quick, nice progressions, either it's like there. Up one side of the field. Like, it's still there, but yeah, I just don't think we've seen it enough.
2021, when they didn't make the playoffs, like they've been showing this for now 3 seasons. What came together last year was that they could run out there and do that for a whole half on you,
Yeah. No, I think some of the shooting decisions have not been great. They had one, I think it was maybe one specific point against Carolina where both teams were just like launching the disc back and forth, and there were like 5 turnovers, and it's like, why don't you just dial it back, like run the system you know how to run. Well, and that's I don't know. I still think they're like going through some rotational things too. Like, obviously Fitzgerald is a new addition to the O-line this year. They were using Noah Chambers on offense last weekend against Atlanta and Carolina. So I also just think it's early, and they're still probably working out the kinks, but this seems like a get right game opportunity for them.
They seem to get caught a little bit in playing down. I think we kind of saw bits and pieces of that even against Houston in their first game of the year, where Houston took that early lead on them, and it was kind of like, what's going on here? We expected this to be a pretty sizable Soul win, but they're working through stuff. Like you say, it's still the first month of play, and with the way that these schedules are so imbalanced with how many games a given team plays, it's sort of hard to really calibrate what to expect when, again, it's not even Memorial Day. We're still 8 days away from that weekend. So, So we just wanted to get to kind of 3 last games, 2 road trips to take note of at the top of the East Division, both New York and DC. Going on the road, DC will face off against the Rush in Toronto in a rematch of a 1-goal game from last year, where the Rush managed to turn it into an offensive shootout. I believe it was 27-25. The Breeze came away with the win, but it was just back and forth the whole time. Rowan McDonald had a great game on offense. It sounds like, due to limited travel roster, he will be slotting in again on offense. So could anticipate another big weekend from him. DC looking to bounce back again after their tough overtime 1-goal loss to New York this past weekend. And the Rush looking to build off of their first win of 2023 this past weekend, 25-20 at home against the Royale. Mike McKenzie making his return to the Rush emphatically once again, just picking up immediately where he left off in the 2021 Canada Cup final, where he was just skying and balling all over the people. He had 8 scores last weekend against the Royale. What do you expect?
I will just to quickly hype up Mike McKenzie even more. Some of his throws were just like the jaw-dropping types of IO inside flicks that Jack Williams does so well, but Mike McKenzie was doing these at like 30, 40 yards out. They were just so smooth looking, just hitting guys in stride. I really like the development we've seen from him over the years. I do think he's even better. And the fact that he started off as just sort of this defensive playmaking specialist, but now is a pure all-around weapon, I think is an awesome ad for Toronto. So yeah, I'm curious, this DC Toronto game, I feel like there's such a slim chance that we get anything close to what happened last year. That just seemed so fluky. right? Like Toronto is probably not going to convert at like 75% of their offensive possessions, right? Am I right for saying that? The one thing is, you say DC is traveling a little light. You know, they won't have Christian Box, they won't have Tyler Monroe. It is a revenge game for Ben Ort. I want to point that out. But yeah, what do you like? Do you think there's any possibility that this game stays close? I just feel like on paper, DC should dominate the Rush, right?
I think if the Rush do the same thing as last year, where they turn up the tempo and they turn this into a track meet and they try to challenge a short rostered Breeze team's legs, like they got to make this into run. You got to cover us. We'll get fresh legs out. We'll challenge you a little bit. Maybe we don't necessarily care about the overall score, but we're going to make some points tough for you. I think that they just got to run that back. I think that this has to be like a 50 plus combined scores type of game for Toronto to have a chance, because I just, their defense.
But I think the DC defense is too good. Defensively, they still got most of their starters.
Yeah, right. And DC did I think a very good job on New York last weekend. I know that, you know, Jeff Babbitt went for 7 goals and the Empire still came away with the win, but I thought that they sort of forced New York to play into that super evolved Super Saiyan mode that they go into now whenever they're challenged. Yeah. And that's what you have to do with New York. You can't just let them run away with it defensively, you know, which is what they do against virtually every team. I favor DC, but again, this is one of those games where if Toronto wins this, that just flips everything, right? Like that upends everything. Then the Rush is 0-2 catastrophe to start the season, where they lose both games by double digits on the road. Suddenly becomes 2-2, and they have a victory against one of the top 2-3 teams in the league. And then for DC, you go from 2-0 and on the verge of finally, like we say this the last 5 times they met, but finally overcoming New York. And so then they don't. Now they're slipping to 2-2 and suddenly looking at the rest of the fray in the East. Like,
Boston creeps up. Boston's in first place all of a sudden.
If Boston wins and DC loses, Boston would have a 2-game advantage in the standings. And if you told me that before the season, that before Memorial Day, the Glory would have a 2-game advantage on the Breeze in the standings, I would have laughed you out of the room. So, there's some intrigue. And then the other East Division beast going on the road, New York taking their unblemished 18-game winning streak into Philadelphia against the reeling 0-3 Phoenix. I wrote about it in the Power Rankings this week. They're finding creative ways to lose at this point, I think, for the Phoenix. You know, they've lost a blowout, a 1-goal game, and then now a game in which they had a
they've done everything. They've done it all.
They've done it all, but in the wrong directions. I don't know what to say about Philly at this point. I'm flummoxed. I really thought that they were going to be a pretty feisty contender in the playoff scene in the East, and that just doesn't seem to be the case. The offense seems to have taken a step backward, and that's just a disastrous thing when you're facing down this New York defense, who is looking like the best unit ever. And I was thinking about this going into this recording. I don't know the exact number of games, but you can't score 20 goals on them anymore. You just can't. No one's doing it. No one did it at championship weekend. The Breeze can't do it. I don't know how you work against their rotations on defense. I don't know how you get chemistry going against them. Like, reiterate this point, this defense cares about the small things. They've given up being like a highlight team. Like, that's 2019 Empire, that's 2021 Empire. Like, this team got frustrated after they housed Philly in week 1, right? Like, they were upset with that win. They won by 9 goals. They held Philly to under 10 goals total. Yeah. And New York has talked extensively about how that was a disappointing win for them. I mean, that's what you're competing against when you're facing the Empire. Perfection. And so for Philly, it's just they've got to reverse it. Like, they've got to, I don't know how. I don't know how after that just gut punch in Boston this past weekend, they pick themselves up and get ready for New York this week, but they've got to. Like, it's kind of like the truest iteration of what Philly wants, which is just they've got to do it now. It's just got to happen. This Phoenix rebirth has to just, rise up.
Yeah, it's hard because I do think that their offense should be or is better than what we've seen from they should not be converting at 25% or whatever it is on the season. They are better than that. It's weird because it is such a similar line to last year. I mean, they still got Thorne, they still got Ryan, Mott, Pollard, Greg Martin, all those staples are back. I think it's a matter of time before they have just a game where they do fully click. I just don't think it's going to come this week. I think there's such a small chance that they can do that against the New York defense, like you said, that has just been playing lights out all year. So I'm not totally giving up on Philly at this point, but it would shock me if their offense is able to keep pace with New York in this one.
And then last but not least, we want to touch on one other Central Division game against two teams kind of with their backs against the wall, at least as far as just needing to get a little bit higher into the standings, and that's the Madison Radicals taking their 0-1 record on the road, going to face the Indianapolis Alley Cats, who got their first win of 2023 this past weekend, 19-16 against the Union in Chicago. Madison has won the past 3 matchups between these two teams. In Indy, they hold a slight advantage. Their offense has played at a higher level indoors, obviously, and they've just taken advantage of that, I think, in each of these individual matchups.
Mm-hmm.
Alley Cats, I like in this particular game. I think they kind of break the mini streak the Radicals have been forming at Grand Park. Cameron Brock returns to the lineup after being inactive this last weekend. He's going to come out motivated. Indy seemed to have solved a lot of the offensive problems that plagued them in their 2 losses this past week against Chicago. They got way more simple. They stopped taking the risky huck looks. They stopped turning the ball over deep, and they started just running everything through Travis Carpenter, who, by the way, is back. Looks back. Looks so good. He made that open field, tumbling running catch and just popped up and lasered a backhand to somebody in stride to continue the fast break. Vintage Carpenter. So, seeing him and he's just got that verve back, that insistence. He's eliminated mistakes from his game. He's one of those distributors at this point who you can just trust with the rock. And I think that just takes Indy's offense to the place where we both like it, which is that known quantity. We know what each of these players bring. We know what looks they like to do at this position of the field and just sort of going out and running their sets. And so I like that. And again, against a Madison defense who didn't look great against the Thunderbirds, had a really, really hard time getting their throwers out of rhythm. They're going to be indoors against this Alley Cats team is starting to get some confidence. They're still dealing with some injuries on both of their lines. Radicals don't start 0-2, but they're staring down the barrel of it here, facing a tough road matchup.
Yeah, they're just to compare it to the first indoor game we saw from Indy against Minnesota. If you compare Madison to Minnesota, Minnesota's offense, I trust not infinitely more than Madison's, but significantly more than Madison's at this point this season. And then defensively, you saw Minnesota making all those plays down the stretch and even taking advantage of, they were was it 2 different Cam Brock backhands that Dylan DeClerc got layout Ds on? It might have been, but Minnesota has guys like that can just take advantage of less than ideal throwing options, and I just don't think Madison quite has the same playmaking ability. And that combined with some still questions on their offense, again, indoor, it's going to look good and better than it probably did at Pittsburgh. But I still think Indy should be favored by at least a few goals in this game. I do agree with you. It seems like they're kind of slowly getting their mojo back after those 2 initial losses. I also think Xavier Payne on offense, it's the type of thing where he likes to take those shots, but when he is being a little bit more selective, which I think he has the past 2 weeks in particular, they look really good because he still possesses that vertical dimension, the ability to stretch the field, but without leaning on that so much. And kind of Indy going back to the basics, as you were saying, is a really good look for this team where they still have that firepower, just don't need to overly rely on that. So I would definitely circle him as well. See if he can keep those turnovers down.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Madison's dearth of playmakers on D-line, they're out Sterling Kanaki. KPS is still dealing with some injuries. They're banged up. They're waiting for some college kids to come in. They're waiting for Jake Miller to return from his ACL surgery. Like, there's just a lot of waiting right now. And on the flip side, Indy, we were wondering when this young unit was maybe going to start stepping up. Well, they've started to. You know, I think it's led by Jake Fella, who continues to just play super, super solid defense for their D-line. Nick Hutton looks great throwing for them on the counterattack, but they've got this teenager, William Wettengel, who has 6 blocks in 3 games now, and they're good blocks. You know, they're all very good standing around swatting something deep. He's 6'2"-ish. He's
I think bigger. I think he's like 6'5". He's like a Drew Swanson type in my mind.
Sneaks. He's got quiet feet, man, and he's gotten 2 separate blocks, just kind of reading out the flow of the offense, and then like in a very Ben Katzian way, sort of using his length and coming around and just like getting a paw on it, and off we go into a counterattack. Like, I've been so impressed with him. I was actually talking a little bit with Cam Brock about him. Apparently, Wettengel has just been demanding the Brock matchup at practices every single point he can. Yeah, I know. Anytime you got the young guy just looking to test himself immediately against, you know, the team legend, I just eat that stuff up. So, yeah, I like Indy's playmaking potential in this matchup. So, Indy's got a slight favor, but again, Madison bringing a 3-game winning streak at Indy into this matchup. That'll do it for this Week 4 preview episode. We'll be wrapping it up here. We'll be back with you on Sunday night, recapping all of this action. I honestly can't wait. I think I've been slowly talking myself into a fervor throughout this entire episode because there's just so many interesting ways. I think we were kind of uncertain how to approach this episode because there wasn't big, meaty, juicy red steak sort of thing like we had last week with, you know, New York at DC. But there's going to be so much to dig through as far as where do all these trajectories start really heading as some teams
we're gonna learn
start to drop off and some teams start to, you know, churn forward. So I can't wait to talk to you all in a couple days. I'm sure Daniel can either. Again, you can find all the information about this week's schedule on the AUDL.com website, as well as tune in on watch.audl.tv. We'll see you all soon. Bye now.